Are we just good to start whenever we're ready? Oh, okay. Sorry about that.
We're ready for you as the negative.
Yeah, we're ready. The negative's ready.
Okay, awesome. The Atlantic Coast Conference is on record as strongly supporting diversity. In a June 2nd, 2020 letter, the ACC Commission, John Swafford wrote, quote, "The Atlantic Coast Conference remains strongly committed to upholding the values of equity, diversity, inclusion, and non-discrimination. Racism and injustice have no place in society. Despite this lofty rhetoric, the ACC has not taken bold steps to promote the hiring of minority candidates. Therefore, Boston College supports the proposition resolved ACC member institutions should adopt a rule requiring them to interview at least one minority candidate for all head coach and athletic director openings for their Division I sports programs." In this debate, we will support the resolution by outlining three major points. First, ACC athletic departments lack diversity. Second, this lack of diversity harms athletic programs and society at large. And third, our plan will recommend the ACC adopting a rule requiring colleges to interview at least two minority candidates for all head coaches and ADs. Our first major point is that the ACC athletic departments lack diversity. Minority head coaches in the ACC are grossly underrepresented in comparison to the racial composition of the students competing. Consider the situation in college football. Among the 14 ACC football programs, there is only one minority coach, Dino Babers of Syracuse, who is African American. This is disgraceful in a sport where 52% of the players are African American. There's also a great disparity in male college basketball. In the ACC, there are only 4 African American head coaches out of 15. ACC basketball, where 54% of its players are African American, should have more than 4 minority head coaches. Women's basketball is not much better. In the ACC, there are only 5 female African American coaches. White coaches predominate in ACC women's basketball, despite the fact that only 23% of ACC female basketball players are white. Perhaps the most glaring instance of discrimination exists in ACC baseball, where not a single African American has been hired as a head baseball manager over the past 67 years of the ACC's existence. Other large disparities exist in other ACC sports. For example, in male soccer, white players make up only 47% of the athletes, yet an astounding 92% of the coaches are white. Another example is in tennis. In male tennis, 73% of the ACC coaches are white, whereas only 49% of the tennis players are white. In women's tennis, 82% of the ACC coaches are white, despite having only 49% of the female tennis players being white. What about the hiring of diverse athletic directors? Here again, the ACC is failing miserably. Of the 15 ADs in the ACC, there is only one person of color. Carla Williams of the University of Virginia is African American. The other 14 ADs are composed of 13 white females and one white female AD at the University of Pittsburgh. Our second major point is that promoting greater diversity in athletic hiring is morally required. Chantisa Furheef, PhD candidate at Fan Nol University, observes in the European Journal of Multidisciplinary Studies in 2016 that whether, quote, job discrimination is intentional or it is conscious, it is always immoral. Job discriminations violate utilitarian rights and justice principles of ethics, end quote. There are also overwhelming financial benefits to having diverse athletic programs. According to a 2020 Nielsen sports study, sports fans far outpace the general population in terms of support for racial equality, with 70% supporting greater diversity initiatives. On this basis, Professor Richard Lipchak of the University of Central Florida argues that college conferences who promote diversity will be able to more effectively recruit and retain student athletes, have more fans in the seats, enhance their broad and boost fundraising with alumni. Moreover, diversity in coaching is important to provide students with role models to emulate. Cassandra Ramsey, an attorney specializing in sports law, observed in 2018 that studies indicate that a lack of diversity in teaching K through 12 students harms the academic performance of African Americans. Students benefit from having teachers who look like them. Athletes are no different. Diverse coaches, she says, will serve as role models to aspire minority athletes to become a coach, athletic director, or even a conference commissioner. Our third point advocates a plan to solve for lack of diversity. The ACC should adopt a rule requiring that at least 2 minority candidates should be interviewed for all head coach and AD positions. The ACC will hire Dr. Richard Lipchak of the University of Central Florida to monitor compliance. The ACC will impose financial sanctions for non-compliance. An abundance of evidence proves that this plan will increase the diversity of hiring. In 2003, the NFL adopted the Rooney Rule, which required all teams to interview at least one minority candidate. Later on, it was expanded to include GAs. A study of Cynthia Dubois of Northwestern looking at hiring data from 1992 to 2014 found that the Rooney Rule increased the probability of a minority being hired from 19 to 21%. And while minority hiring has fluctuated over the years in the NFL, there is no question that more minorities have been hired due to the Rooney Rule. Law professor Drew of American University noted in 2020 that since the Rooney Rule took effect, NFL clubs have hired 14 head coaches of color and 12 general managers of color. More evidence that the Rooney Rule works comes from Oregon. In 2009, the state of Oregon adopted the Rooney Rule, and it resulted in Portland State and Western Oregon universities hiring Black athletic directors, and at least 2 head football coaches at the University of Oregon have been African American and Cuban American. Finally, a 2016 study conducted by the University of Colorado professors and published in the Harvard Business Review determined that if the Rooney Rule had required 2 peoples of color to be interviewed instead of 1, the odds of hiring a person of color would have increased by 33%. Professor Stephanie Johnson observed that when there is one minority candidate being interviewed, that candidate is not taken seriously. The person is perceived to be in an interview pool as a check-the-box candidate to simply comply with the Rooney Rule. But when 2 minority candidates are interviewed, Johnson explains, the interviewer is more likely to compare the qualifications of the minority candidates, making it more likely that they will be evaluated as serious candidates. Thank you.
Is the affirmative ready for cross? Is everyone here present ready for cross? Getting nods, that's good. Okay, I'm starting my timer now. So my first question is, how can we call a 20-year-old rule bold?
I'm sorry, can you restate the question? I didn't quite hear you.
So the Rooney Rule, as you pointed out, was implemented in 1999. How can you call that a bold policy when it's been 22 years since that's been adopted in the NFL?
Well, considering it's a bold policy because it's resulted in the hiring of 14 head coaches of color and 12 general managers of color, I think the fact that it's had such a great effect on the hiring of minority candidates in the NFL.
This brings me on to my next question. How can you consider it a success in the NFL when you've seen a 2% increase? 2% is not a very high number. And over the course of the past 20 years, since 2003, when the NFL implemented the Rooney Rule, there were 3 minority coaches in 2003, and there are 3 now. So how can you call that an improvement in the probability of minority coaches being hired?
I think a large part of that is also just due to fluctuations in turnover rates. In 2018, they lost like 5 minority head coaches in 1 year, which is just a statistical outlier that doesn't normally happen with turnover. So it's important to keep that in mind too, that turnover rate in 2018 really, I guess, is like affecting the number as well, but also just the fact that over the years, it has resulted in the hiring of candidates. And you mentioned that 2% is small. However, 14 head coaches of color and 12 general managers of color, I think that's a significant number. And those, without this rule,
I'm running out of time. So if it's okay, I'm going to ask more questions, if that's okay. So you mentioned that your resolution was the requirement of 2 interviews, but the resolution that we've been given to prepare for suggests 1. How do you do you consider it fair to give us a different resolution than the one we prepared for?
Yeah, absolutely. Because in the resolution, it says at least 1, and 2 is included in at least 1, because it didn't say 1. In the resolution, it says at least 1.
Right, but it states that the resolution states that the requirement is 1. Obviously, they can interview more, but your requirement.
Well, it says the
2.
requirement is at least. It says the requirement is at least 1.
And you're saying it's at least 2. I'm going to move on to further questions. So you talk about the Rooney Rule or the Robinson Rule as going to increase hiring, but it's only addressing the interview pool. So we have a source from athleticdirectoru.com saying that when ACC current athletic directors were polled, they said they already implement a similar thing to the Rooney Rules. And your evidence is saying the Rooney Rule is going to help, but 8 athletic directors here say they already implement that into their hiring practice. So how is your resolution going to substantially improve diversity if we're being told by athletic directors that they're already implementing it?
Well, because as we see in the ACC and in the main, in connection with the ACC's main mission of strongly committed to upholding the values of equity, diversity, inclusion, and non-discrimination.
We agree with the main mission. We're asking how your resolution achieves
exactly.
That.
Yeah, and I'm saying that when you're saying that the ADs are already doing it, our point is like, how can we trust that? The reason why the ACC is already.
This is a very good transition.
I need to respond to that question.
Understood.
Is considering that you said the ACC, you could just let athletic directors monitor themselves. I don't think that is going to be effective at all, because if we continue to let them monitor themselves, then we're going to find ourselves in the same position that the ACC is in right now, which is
How will
underrepresented.
you institute accountability then? So you're saying we
With
need
Dr.
accountability.
Yeah, exactly. With Dr.
Richard
Richard Lipchuk of the University of Central Florida, who's going to be hired to monitor compliance, and the ACC will impose financial sanctions for noncompliance when this third party, Dr. Richard Lipchuk, is going to find a school if it's in violation. He's a third party not affiliated with the ACC, so he's not biased. If he finds them to be in violation of the rule, then the ACC will impose financial sanctions for noncompliance of the rule.
I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is everyone ready for our first affirmative constructive from Archie? I'm going to slightly move the camera to promote everyone being able to hear Archie and see him as he speaks. That's okay. Just adjust, and we can rotate that up a bit. Sorry about that.
All right, judges ready? All right,
I'm going to ready our timer as well.
all right, opponents ready? All right, and I will start now. The affirmative exclusively focuses on a small part of the resolution rather than the discrimination in the workplace, rather than the resolution itself. While we, the negative, believe and actually agree with the affirmative that discrimination and the lack of diversity are major issues in the modern American workplace, and especially in head coaching faculty members, we disagree that the resolution stated is the ideal solution. We, the negative, propose that the affirmative's plan to implement a policy that will require all coaching universities and athletic directors to interview at least one minority candidate, or in this case two, which is essentially a change of the proposition, is inherently flawed, and we'll examine why by looking at three main points. First, we look at the fact that this does not solve the inherent issues present in the lack of diversity in college athletics. Second, we look at the implementation of the Rooney Rule in the NFL and why it's not been successful over the past 17 years. And finally, we'll look at the fact that there's a counter proposal of a pledge, the CECBDU, which is a collegiate diversity pledge, which will be essentially better than what the affirmative is saying. So first, the fact that the affirmative's proposal does not explicitly address the major problems that are affiliated with this issue. According to a source by the Oxford Sociology Journal, hiring practices directors are explicitly biased in their hiring practices. Universities, other positions, and employment positions tend to promote individuals who are the same race as the individuals who are hiring them. This leads us to the point of tokenization. So tokenization, in definition, is when these coaching, the universities and individuals who have been systematically in power, such as individuals who control the coaching directory, athletic directors, often white males, tend to interview those that are only going to interview minority candidates as a sort of statement and just as a token in order to ensure that they don't receive any negative repercussions from the society at large. However, they will not hire these candidates. As another source by the Athletic Director Review states, according to another African-American coach in the NFL, the Rooney Rule actually hurt these individuals because while tokenization helps some increases in the short term, the 2% as noted by the affirmative, it did not encapsulate and allow for these coaches to stay long term. These coaches are only for the head coaches positions, as we noted, and they don't have the same opportunities and the same ability to come up as their peers do. As the same source notes, these positions are only for the head level coaches, which means that coordinator level positions are restricted to the same biases they were before. Often, a head coaching position in the NFL and college athletics is filled by these assistant coaches and the coordinator level positions, and by restricting the proposition to only head coaching levels, it's saying that these minority candidates will not feel welcome in their own domain. To the second point, the fact that the Rooney Rule as a whole is not effective. Now, as the affirmative noted, the Rooney Rule had some sort of substantial impact. However, as our source from the NCAA itself notes, that many in the universities, in the NCAA and the ACC already implement some sort of Rooney Rule or Robinson or whatever you want to call it, where they interview one minority candidate. Clearly, if you look at statistics in sports such as golf, basketball, women's basketball, football, this has not had any substantial effect. So we, the negative, cannot see how the affirmative thinks that just making this rule into words will do anything. Second, there's also the issue of legality and enforcement. For example, in Florida, in the Florida legal system, judging candidates on their race is explicitly illegal. Now, in order to put this policy into effect, you would essentially be judging candidates on their race. And in a state such as Florida, this is explicitly illegal. So we the name don't see how universities in these positions can do this when it's illegal for them, and they may face legal fines for it. Now, this moves us to a final point, which is the fact that the counter proposal, the College Diversity Athletic Pledge, is much better than the proposition outlined above. Now, the College Diversity Pledge is essentially a pledge made by all universities stating that they will do more to advocate for diversity. Now, while the affirmative simply seems to improve upon their proposal by renaming it completely and changing it from 1 to 2, which clearly it states that the minimum requirement is 1, and as long as universities fulfill that requirement, it's satisfactory. Without getting into that, it's quite clear that this alternative proposal of a pledge is much better. The main reason is, as the NCAA itself notes, and as other workplaces directories note, simply advocating for a minority tokenization process is not sufficient. In the workplace, for example, there's implementation similar to the Rooney Rule itself, where minority candidates are given an interview. However, as seen in the workplace and in many Fortune 500 companies, this has not seen any sort of substantial increase in the amount of present of minority candidates and in the workforce, such as minority candidates of color, people from the LGBTQ community, and women. So rather, the proposal towards increased diversity would lead to a third party outlining and ensuring that all universities are meeting the requirements for diversity as stated in the pledge. So in conclusion, we, the negative, believe that the judge should vote negative because of this outlines below. First, we've stated that the Rooney Rule and Robinson Rule does not fix the implicit bias and the implicit problems in the hiring world. Second, we stated that the Rooney Rule is inefficient in the NFL. And finally, we stated a counter proposal that seems to work better and avoids all legality issues. Thank you. And now we have Cross, I believe. I am ready when the third of this.
Can everyone see Archie?
Where's
Here's the Zoom. Can everyone see Archie? There we go. Sorry about that.
Are you guys ready for Cross?
Yep.
Okay, so I would first like to start with your first, I guess, main point, which is that the counter diversity, the college diversity pledge, and that it will be better. My first question is, considering this is just simply a pledge and is not any rule changes as we're discussing and anything actually enforceable and not binding, how is this pledge better?
The pledge has external accountability. So according to a source by the Oxford Journal itself, universities love bureaucracy. I'm sure you know this. And by introducing third parties who hold these universities accountable for the pledges they outline and the diversity statements they outline in their own diversity statements, we believe will be more effective than what's already being implemented.
I guess, so then that leads me to my next question. What is that? What does that enforcement look like from the third party of your schools?
The third party, especially since this is a public institution, the ACC is public and it's compromised to many public institutions, the third party will have qualified accountability, which will essentially impose fines if the member institutions fail to live up to the requirements of diversity as outlined.
And how much would those fines be? And how would they determine those fines?
The fines will essentially be determined by experts who are third parties. So they're not essentially affiliated with the university athletic board itself. There'll be third parties compromised, the people of color and of other disfranchised individuals, where essentially it's much more fair, because mostly you have individuals in power who are often comprised of white males deciding what the fine should be and what the repercussions should be. But in this case, it'll be compromised primarily the people being affected.
And you also talk about how the Rooney Rule doesn't work and how the Rooney Rule is a failure. Whether or not we agree with that, our plan is having 2 candidates, which is not the Rooney Rule. It's distinctively different.
Yeah, and
so do you have any evidence that adding another candidate is going to make it any worse than or do you have any evidence that that this is worse than the Rooney
Well,
Rule?
you're essentially just increasing the I would argue that the resolution, this is you're going against the resolution, but B, if we stand by your proposition of adding an additional candidate, it will essentially add more tokenization. Sure, instead of going from 1, you're going to 2. It still makes these minority coaches tokens, as you're only putting them in head coaching positions where there will be. So imagine if you're a head coach, you're a person of color, you're in a primarily white dominated field where all your assistants and coordinators are white.
And I suppose that also brings me to my next fact. You say it's only for head coaches. However, in our plan, we mentioned that it's for for head coaches as well as GMs, ADs, and essentially just minorities in power positions of these schools. So
again, the resolution itself says it's only for head coaches. If you're altering the resolution, I believe that's false. I feel like that's a false claim. B, I think even if you expand to everything else, there's still going to be sham interviews being conducted, because you're going to have essentially athletic directors who right now are still white. And while your proposition may change that 100 years from now, it will be extremely hard in order to convince these athletic directors to not conduct sham interviews, and essentially, which has been going on in the NFL, as we noted.
I guess that leads me to what evidence do you have that the Rooney or that the diversity pledge would be better than the actual Rooney Rule? Like, what specific evidence do you have, even pointing to the college diversity pledge being successful at all?
So it's adaptive accountability, and other NCC member institutions have adopted this. And actually, with regards to the Rooney Rule itself, NCAA member institutions have adopted the 1 and potentially even 2 policy. And in the West Coast Conference, actually, has signed this pledge and has seen a substantial increase in the amount of minority head coaches and the amount of minority athletic directors. And
yeah, but my question is directly like, what evidence do you have that the college diversity pledge would work at all?
The West Coast Conference did something that's essentially the college diversity pledge that we are proposing, and they saw a substantial increase in the amount of minority candidates available.
All right, that is my time. Thank you.
We're ready for the next constructive whenever else.
I should be here because I'm crossing.
Yes, that's right. Good.
Okay, I'm ready. Is everybody ready?
Okay. I'm ready as well.
Before refuting the negatives arguments, I would like to reaffirm our case. There's indisputable evidence of discrimination in the hiring of head coaches and ADs in the ACC. In our first speech, we documented racial disparity in head coaching in football, male and women's basketball, baseball, male soccer, and men's and women's tennis. As for athletic directors, there is only 1 minority out of 15 in the ACC. The ACC has a moral duty to reduce discrimination in hiring. Racism is immoral, unjust, and harmful to individuals and society. There are numerous benefits to promoting diversity. ACC colleges will improve the recruiting and retention rates of athletes, expand support among fans, and generate higher fundraising from alumni. Diverse coaching is also vital to provide role models for minority students. The affirmative plan will solve for lack of diversity. Our plan requires every ACC school to interview at least 2 coaches for all head coach and AD job openings. The ACC will enforce the plan by hiring Richard Lapchick, the head of the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sports, who will monitor compliance. The ACC will impose financial penalties on schools found non-compliant. We have empirical evidence that the plan will work from the effective adoption of a rule mandating that at least 1 minority be interviewed for head coaching jobs in Oregon and the NFL. The DuBois study found that the Rooney Rule increases minority hiring in the NFL by 19 to 21%. Most important, our plan will be more effective than that by requiring that 2 minority candidates be interviewed. The 2016 University of Colorado study found that going from 1 to 2 minority candidates in an interview pool will expand minority hiring 33% above that achieved by the Rooney Rule. Now I would like to respond to the negative argument. In your argument, you discussed that there will be sham or token interviews. So mandating 2 minority candidates instead of 1 solves for the sham interviews. Our 1AC evidence from Stephanie Johnson proves this. She says Rooney Rule would have increased minority hiring by 30% more if 2 candidates were interviewed. The plan has oversight and monitoring to prevent sham interviews. Richard Lapchick monitors hiring to determine if sham interviews are being done. And requiring interviewing 2 diverse candidates solves for token interviews. Check the box. Stephanie Johnson, Associate Professor of Management Entrepreneurship at University of Colorado School of Business 2018. And that our research found that when only one woman or person of color in a finalist pool of job candidates, that candidate stands out so much that they have essentially no chance of being hired. Importantly, we've also found that interviewing two minority candidates can make the difference and lead to their hiring. Mandating diverse candidate slates can improve diversity overall. When it comes to creating token candidates, check a box, but given no consideration, are finalist slates. I agree, interviewing one person of color might not necessarily lead to greater diversity, but interviewing more than one might. Even if the token interview is beneficial, it provides a candidate with exposure and experience, and the hiring committee could decide to pick them. From Ramsey, Attorneys and Sports Law Chair for the District of Columbia Bar Arts, Media, Entertainment, and Sports Law Community 2018. Even if the interview is a token interview, it's helpful because it gives the candidate exposure for when another opportunity arises. Moreover, the rule may force the hiring committee to consider candidates that they would not have interviewed otherwise. In the process, the committee may find that the perceived candidate is actually the best candidate for the job. You also assert that at least one can't mean two. Our counter interpretation is that at least one means one or more, and it can mean two. From Klein, Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, Ohio Court of Appeals, 1995. At least one means greater than or equal to one. For example, two is at least one. We meet the affirmative plan requires 2 interviews for every head coach and AD hire. The affirmative interpretation is reasonable. The literature supports interviewing 2 candidates, and we read solvency evidence from the Colorado study saying 2 minority candidates solves best. Best plain meaning of at least one means more or more than one. Means one or more than one. From Stat Mueller, U.S. Wisconsin District Judge 2012. The plain language of the term at least one clearly means one or more than one. If a person on the street asks another for at least $1, the second person would know that the first was requiring one or more than $1. And there is no ground loss for the negative. A bigger affirmative plan gives the negative more ground to attack. You talked about the Collegiate Coaching Diversity Pledge. CCDP pledge does not apply to hiring athletic directors. It applies only to men's and women's basketball coaches and football. From Medcop, ESPN writer 2020. 30 Division I athletics directors have signed the Collegiate Coaching Diversity Pledge. To adhere to the pledge, schools must have a finalist pool that includes at least one candidate from a traditionally underrepresented background and one non-diverse candidate in men's basketball, women's basketball, and football. We can't solve for diversity unless the ACC hires more diverse ADs. From Saunders, 2017. The key stakeholders in the interview process, the deputy athletic director, as well as the chancellor president, came towards the end of the hiring process to meet and approve of the final candidate. And the athletic director serves as the point person for the hire and the primary negotiator during the hire and agreement phase of the process.
Are you ready for cross, judge and opponent?
Yes, I'm ready.
All right. So first, you mentioned that the diversity is an issue, and while we agree with it, can you elaborate more on how specifically the ACC, the rule that you state, will solve the diversity issue?
Well, we think that advocating for interviews of 2 or more candidates makes the interviewers consider the minority candidates more than as a token interview.
Okay, so if an AD is willing to do a salmon review for one candidate and essentially invoke implicit racism hiring bias, what will prevent them from doing with 2? As we have noted before, in the NFL with the Rooney Rule, there were actually cases in which teams did sham interviews with one candidate. And as we have stated before, all these athletic directors are mostly, of Caucasian affluent backgrounds. What is to prevent them from doing the same thing with two candidates?
Well, so you referenced in the Stephanie Johnson's in saying that when it comes to interviewing two or more minority candidates can make the difference and lead to their hiring. And maybe
All right, I'm going to move on. What is your definition of minority? Because you keep mentioning minority candidates. The resolution does mention, but what is your specific definition of the affirmative of what constitutes a minority candidate?
Our definition is that minority is any person who is non-white.
So any person who's not white, right now they're a minority, but I think the term minority is inherently violent and leaves people of color to be disenfranchised because you're calling them a minority. That's implicit connotations. And what about, for example, LGBTQ communities and women? Are they not, is someone who is a member of the LGBTQ community and white, are they considered not to be a minority? Because according to our studies, clearly they are underrepresented in the coaching field.
We are focusing on the legal definition of minority that relates to.
So we're focusing on the legal definition of minority, and in the resolution, it's quite stated that minority, the definition of minority is important because you're saying that it requires institutions to interview at least one minority coordinator. But if we don't know the definition of minority, we can't essentially say that, you said non-white. Are you saying that someone from the LGBTQ community, for example, won't be included in this proposition?
Affirm that the
okay. I'm gonna move on because I'm running out of time. Okay. So you didn't address. So how would so we mentioned the Florida law. So how do you think the implementation of your proposition will avoid any legality issues with states that have similar rules to Florida, where you cannot discriminate based on race and you cannot do any job interviews based on race?
When you reference this, you're talking about the ability of enforcement of the rule, correct?
Yeah, we're talking about how when we mentioned in our argument in our constructive that in Florida law, it is essentially illegal and will often constitute a fine for member institutions. And there are many ACC member institutions in the state of Florida who would be incurring this fine and these legal issues if they adopted something similar to this. Because of the nature, which I don't think you made a distinction between the NFL being a private organization and the ACC being compromised to mostly public institutions.
I think in terms of enforcement, the ACC has instituted.
I'm not talking about enforcement, but it appears we're out of time anyway. So, thank you.
Is judge and opposite affirmative? Sorry, I'm British. I can't get the term opposition out of my head. Are the judge and the affirmative ready for me to begin my first constructive?
Second constructive.
Yeah. Not hearing any objections, so I'm going to assume everyone's ready. So I'm going to set up my timer. And my time starts now. So the affirmative has very convincingly argued that diversity is a huge problem in collegiate athletics, and we agree. I watched an interview by Athletic Director Yu this past weekend, where Dr. Leonard Moore from University of Texas said, this system, this racially non-diverse and non-diverse in so many aspects, these institutions are near to collapse because the players do not feel represented by the coaches. They do not feel heard by the coaches. They don't think the spaces are inclusive. I mean, in the NFL, coming out as an LGBT individual is not easy. And it's not easy to begin with, right? But if we then have sporting institutions that make it even harder, what does that do to, what is that? That is not the ACC's core values, right, that they have stated. So we agree that diversity is a problem, but we don't understand as the negative how the Rooney Rule solves this problem. And indeed, we think that our counterproposal, the pledge, is one, more effective as it involves more accountability. It's more comprehensive at tackling the root issues of implicit racism. And it does not have the disadvantages of creating tokenization. It does not have the disadvantages of being illegal in Florida. So I'd like to elaborate on this and respond to some of my opposition's points. So first, the Florida law issue, an executive order written in 1999 by I believe it was Governor Jeb Bush, was signed into law, approved by the Board of Regents of the University System of Florida, and has been upheld ever since, stating that you cannot give preferential treatment in your interview process, any part of your hiring process. There can be no quota if that quota advantages one group and not another. So the way our pledge that we have research gets around this is it's specifically designed to require interviewing of one candidate from each space. But the resolution the AF has proposed does not. And we have to consider what happens if the ACC passes a resolution that is illegal in Florida. Does that lead to budget cuts for FSU's program? Does that lead to the cutting of scholarships for FSU's program? And we've discussed how a lot of the players in these programs, the people who have the most to lose, are minorities. So I would argue that the affirmatives opposition hurts minority more than it helps them. And the additional reason is tokenism. The affirmative has not addressed our argument about tokenism, right? Lots of sources that we have cited and some that we haven't cited have talked about how the Rooney Rule is such a tokenistic approach. It creates this minority status where ADs have to check a box and say, look, we've solved implicit racism, right? And we are not convinced that that box checked, whether it's one or two candidates, is sufficient. And to this point about the two, even if that changes anything, right? If you ask someone for at least $1, and then you say, actually, no, I want at least $2, and they give you $1, you can see how that's different. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, though. So moving on to some of the advantages of the pledge, we've talked about external accountability. The AF has mentioned how this will be enforced by a non-ACC faculty member. And one person to enforce accountability, we do not think is sufficient, which is why the pledge has a host of qualified, intelligent, rigorous, unbiased experts who take this issue seriously, who have an invested interest in this issue, and there's multiple of them. They will not be worried about embarrassing the ACC or any other conference because it's their job to embarrass the ACC. They're not being hired by the ACC, they're being hired by the pledge. And this is why it's worked so well in the West Coast Conference, right? Because you don't have someone hired on the payroll of the West Coast Conference whose job it is essentially to embarrass the West Coast Conference. You have external auditors who can hold the West Coast Conference and the ACC's feet to the fire and say, no, this isn't working. We need these additional steps. And these experts can provide additional solutions, right? So what we, the negative, don't understand is that, or we do understand, the affirmative is giving us a solution that, one, we don't think tackles the root issue. We don't think that requiring a potentially implicitly racist athletic director to interview 1 or 2 or 3 minority candidates solves the actual issue of implicit racism, whereas the pledge does. It's not just going to be investigating quotas. Other parts of the pledge include how to create an inclusive space, how to navigate terms like minority, not just how to solve racial issues, but how to incorporate LGBT individuals. I have extensive experience campaigning for LGBT advocacy issues as part of Pride Alliance at Georgia Tech and in previous institutions. And I can tell you that your policy neglecting to include to include LGBT individuals and trans issues is woefully inadequate and comes as a slap in the face to me and to any of these other underrepresented minorities who are going to see this policy, and it does them more harm than good because they're excluded from this whole process. And even if you do include them, they're tokenized. They don't want to be tokenized. They want the ACC to create sporting teams that are an inclusive space for them. And this is so much of what the pledge solves. It's specifically designed to be legal, to not incur tokenization, and to actually look at what's the real problem here, right? The problem is not that the athletic director forgets to interview minority candidates. The problem is that the athletic director doesn't take minority candidates seriously some of the times. That's why they're not hiring them. And if you're arguing just having a couple more of these minorities in the interview room is going to suddenly create a space that's inclusive to minorities, what's to stop them once they've been hired, if they're hired under your policy, from leaving because they experience homophobic behavior, they experience racist behavior from their fellow coaches? We are not satisfied that the affirmative resolution does more harm, does less harm than good. We think the affirmative resolution has all of these problems with tokenism and illegality, and we don't understand why they would not accept our counter proposal, which has none of these issues and seems to actually tackle the root issue. I'm out of time. Thank you very much. And I'm ready for cross whenever. I'm trying to mute my microphone, but there we go.
Okay, you're ready. You said you're ready. Cross?
I'm ready for cross, yeah.
Okay. So can you talk about a little bit about the preferential treatment in regards to the legality in Florida and how there would be the preferential treatment?
No, so we're arguing that the wording of the affirmatives proposition would be illegal under Florida law for institutions like FSU, which are ACC members. However, the wording of the pledge has been specifically designed to be legal, and it's been implemented in California, which has some similar laws.
You talked a bit about minorities and LGBT. Can you clarify your definition of minority?
So, well, this is our point, right, is that we've asked you to define minority and you've given us the term non-white, and we think that that definition is insufficient. We would argue that LGBT communities, including trans communities, need to be included in this, and non-gender conforming communities, you know, and even women, right, because in some of these women's teams, there are no women in the coaching staff. So we define minority, if we, in the pledge, you know, there's a more comprehensive approach where underrepresented demographics are assisted, as opposed to just people who are non-white, which is a start, but it's not comprehensive enough.
Okay. Can you discuss a bit about the pledge in how this enforcement is going to work? The external auditors?
Yeah, so colleges sign the pledge, they agree to its terms, and then if the pledge finds their conduct unsatisfactory, and they're not following the pledge's recommendations, if the pledge finds there's implicit racism in the process and lack of inclusive spaces, the pledge will reprimand publicly at first, which will create scandal, which colleges hate scandal, as you know. And if the college persists, they will be removed from the pledge. And there may also be some fines associated if the college agrees to them. And you might say that's not accountability, but colleges care about PR. And the point here is that the accountability is enforced externally by people who have an interest in seeing this done fairly, not by someone who's on the payroll of the ACC, who has an interest in not embarrassing the ACC.
Don't you think that with the large budgets of these colleges, that the fines aren't going to be sufficient, or that the blowback from the PR is going to be a story that doesn't last very long?
Well, we think that the panel of critically acclaimed experts with a public voice on this issue will be enough to create pressure. And you know, and you're right. Fines may not phase these institutions, which is why your rule, which is primarily enforced through fines, would have some flaws. Our rule also banks on the fact that there is a lot of more money in publicity than there is in fines. When companies are fined, they pay the fine, they settle the suit, but bad publicity can destroy private enterprises and universities. And we think that it also just serves as an amplifier to the student voices on campus, which want reform.
Okay, thank you. Yes, as it relates to the pledge, you talked about not taking minority candidates seriously. Okay, I'm out of time.
Judge, would you like me to answer the question or no?
I think now is the time for prep time if the affirmative wants it.
So we're not answering questions. Sorry, the audio quality on my end isn't perfect. Or
They're perfect.
they're perfect. Okay, sorry.
We're ready whenever the other team is ready.
We're ready.
We are ready. Yeah.
We are ready.
Awesome. The judge should vote for the team that best solves for racial discrimination, and that team is the affirmative. This is a moral duty to reduce discrimination in hiring. Racism is immoral, unjust, and harmful to individuals. Furhi says jobs discrimination is always immoral because it violates principles of justice and ethics. There are also numerous utilitarian benefits to promoting diversity. ACC colleges will improve their recruiting and retention of athletes, expand support among fans, and generate higher funds from alumni. Diverse coaching is also vital to provide role models for minority students to become successful citizens. It is indisputable evidence that there is a lack of diversity across the board in all ACC Division I sports: football, men's and women's basketball, men's and women's tennis, male soccer. These are all sports lacking diversity in coaching. And ACC baseball has never had an African-American coach in the 67-year history of the conference. The ACC also has a terrible record in diversity for athletic directors. Only one of the 15 ADs are a minority. In this debate, the affirmatives has advocated a plan that guarantees increasing diversity. Our plan is more effective than the Rooney Rule adopted by the NFL in Oregon because it requires interviewing 2 minority candidates instead of just 1. We read solvency evidence from the University of Colorado study by Stephanie Johnson that concludes that the Rooney Rule had required 2 minority candidates, then minority hiring would have increased by 33%. Requiring 2 minority candidates in the pool also solves for the problem of sham and token interviews. While 2 minority candidates competing in interviews, colleges will not perceive that there is 1 token candidate in the pool, and they will be forced to compare the credentials of 2 minority candidates. Professor Johnson said this is why 2 minority candidates dramatically increase the odds of a minority being hired. The people are forced to compare them together. Other criticisms, like lack of enforcement and monitoring, don't apply to our claim. We advocate the hiring of an outside, independent expert, Richard Lipchek, from the Diversity in Sports Institute at Central Florida. He's a professor in diversity in sports. That's all he does, to monitor compliance by ACC schools. If schools are not complying, the ACC has the authority to impose financial penalties. The threat of fines and the loss of reputation and of PR will result in colleges complying with the plan. We completely agree with the opposing side that reputation matters a lot, but we're definitely going to add that money matters a whole lot as well. And to say it doesn't is ridiculous. This is especially the case since 70% of college sports fans support increasing diversity. They know increasing diversity will increase their support for their school, increase alumni donations, and actually increase money. If we can make it a monetary incentivization for them to be more diverse, that's going to be a really good answer. Now, I would like to address some specific negative arguments. First thing, earlier in the debate, we had a contention over the ADs being in our plan and that it's not allowed to be in our plan because it's not in the topic. I would like to say ADs are directly in the topic. It says at least 1 minority candidate for all head coach and athletic director openings. So we are not changing the topic. And also when they say they have a topical argument over at least 1, to say 2 doesn't include at least 1 is just neglecting basic math. And I'm not going to stand this argument anymore because it makes absolutely no sense. And moving on, colleges care about PR. As I said, we certainly agree and we submit that they do, but they care, and we can have a whole debate about this, but we truly believe they care more about money. And for all of these institutions, it always comes down to money. That's how they run. They care about their PR, but they hire PR agencies with money to control their PR. It always goes back to the money. It's the money. And also, when you consider they say they have unbiased people in their group. Well, so do we, except we have an actual expert in diversity and inclusion in sports, Richard Lepchek, this is his job. He got a PhD in this. This is what he does for a living. He will be a much better person to evaluate this. And he's completely third party. He's not in the ACC. So to say that he's biased in some way is ridiculous as well. And moving on, it's illegal. They say that we're illegal. That's a huge part of their argument. No, and this also includes with our definition of minority. We specifically made our definition of minority extremely stringent. We said everybody non-white, so that it could comply with affirmative action laws and policies that are currently in place in Florida. Affirmative action exists in Florida. If you're saying affirmative action or soft affirmative action policies in Florida are completely illegal, that's just not true. And that's why we can't include transgenders in our definition of minority, because if we did, then yes, they would have a point. we would not be complying with Florida law, because Florida law is very stringent on how they actually do their affirmative action policies. But we couldn't include transgenders in our plan. As much as we would love to, we completely agree that others need to be included in this plan, and that our definition of minority isn't exactly great, but that's not our definition. That's the legal definition of minority. In the US law, like, we have no control over that. We're just simply trying to do the best we can and make our thing legal, because we want it to work in Florida. We want it to work everywhere. So we don't want to have that illegal problem, like you mentioned. So that's why our definition of minority is so tight. Also, you say having two people makes absolutely no difference. However, that's absolutely, you're just neglecting a whole part of our argument, which is that hiring increases, or that having two candidates increases hiring, not just increases interviews, increases hiring of minority candidates by 33%. To simply say that them increasing their hiring prospects by 33% is nothing and doesn't work is ridiculous, and is completely neglecting the fact that 33% is a lot. And if you went out there and you asked, and if you got 100 minority candidates and you asked 33 of them, hey, do you think this actually works at this point? I guarantee those 33 are going to say this plan has benefited them. It's better than the Rooney Rule. It is not the Rooney Rule. You keep talking about how the Rooney Rule doesn't work, but it's important to remember ours is not the Rooney Rule. We have two or more candidates. That's a very distinct difference. So all your comparisons with the Rooney Rule simply don't apply in the context of our plan. Thank you.
My time now. Before I address all of and finalize our arguments, I'd like to address some points made by the affirmative in their previous speech. I'd firstly like to just object to the use of the term transgenders. I'm not necessarily comfortable with that, and I know that might have been a slip up, but I thought it was worth time in my speech. And I'd also like to address this 33% statistic that you've invoked, because we have not, I believe, heard that earlier in the debate, and you did not provide a source on that. Well, as we have pointed out, that the Rooney Rule, which is very similar to the proposition, has been implemented in the NFL, and between 2003 and 2021, there's 3 coaches and there's 3 coaches, minority. Now, finally, it was alleged that we implied that the resolution did not include athletic directors. That is not what we said. We said that you have added other coordinators and staff beyond the athletic director and head coach. And, taking aside whether we permit that, given that that was not the resolution we were given to research, I think that the fundamental issue here, and this brings me on to my next point, is not about the number of people interviewed. Okay, and we've stated this many times. And the affirmative has given us a hypothetical. They've said if you ask people whether 2 interviewed is better than 1, they'll tell you, oh, that's what fixes it. And they've said it'll increase massively. We have a study from Forbes that suggests that if your quota is to interview 1 woman, that doesn't work. And when you increase it to interview 2 women, that doesn't work. And the reason why it doesn't work is quite simple, because the premise of this policy is that the athletic director has implicit bias, but if you force them to interview a minority candidate, that implicit bias evaporates. I'm not satisfied with that policy. I have been in interview rooms with people I consider to be implicitly biased, and me being in that room does not change their bias. And this brings us on to the tokenism point. You've alleged that having forcing them to interview 1 doesn't work, but forcing them to interview two does. And see, my point here is that the root issue here is implicit racism. The root issue here is that the person doing that interview in the first place is biased, and that we need to look, our pledge looks at how do we mitigate that bias? How do we create an inclusive space so that when an LGBT individual like me walks into an interview room, I mean, I'm not going to be applying for a head coach, but when I walk into an interview room, it's the same issue. I don't feel like I'm the only LGBT individual to ever be interviewed for a head coach, and that there's no LGBT head coaches, and they're not going to let me in. So I really want to address this tokenism issue, though, because, you know, forcing colleges to check a box is bureaucracy. That they'll say, yes, look, we interviewed these two candidates, but, you know, we eventually didn't decide on choosing them, and that is why policies akin to what you're doing with lower numbers have not achieved the result. Finally, I'd like to talk about your use of the term minority. We asked you, what does your policy define as minority? And you told us non-white because that's the US law. The US law is not a dictionary. You know, individuals can say, we're implementing a policy that means we're going to selectively, you know, make sure to interview at least one minority, and here's how we define minority. That's been done. It's been done in a lot of places. It's done in college affirmative action in admissions. This thing that the non-white use of the term in law evades Florida state law. I'd like to quote to you or paraphrase the letter of the law. The letter of the law is that no, specifically in Florida state institutions such as universities, any hiring decision cannot give advantage or selective advantage to certain demographics. And the reason this is the point is that the pledge we've proposed solved this and intentionally solved this for California by saying, we'll interview one and we'll interview one who's not diverse. And it defines diversity far more and the solutions for diversity, as we've said, far more inclusively. The affirmative has failed to comment on how their policy will retain minorities, how their policy will welcome minorities. They've said that somehow if we require a coach to interview a second minority candidate, the coach's existing implicit bias will evaporate, and we're not convinced of that. Now, to this last point about the panel of experts, your expert is good. We like your expert. Why not? Why not more than one? Our panel, they're not on the ACC's payroll. They're not being commissioned by the ACC. They're being commissioned by the pledge, who has different interests to the ACC. So they're not worried they're going to be dismissed for making saying the wrong thing. And we have multiple people who are PhDs in these issues, as is yours, who have studied this for their whole life, but not just in sports. They've studied from diverse backgrounds. They know about social justice and how to create inclusive spaces. They're experts on every issue. This board of experts is more comprehensive, and we love that you have taken the initiative and said, we'll have an expert look at this. And we say, great. Let's have more experts. Let's have them not on the ACC's payroll, and let's make sure we obey Florida law and don't introduce tokenization. But you know, I'd like to affirm this. We think diversity is so important. We have loved that you have devoted so much time to talking about the importance of diversity, because we agree, and we go further that this is an urgent issue. As I stated in a previous constructive, the urgency of this issue cannot be ignored. The system is unsustainable in its exploitation of minorities by non-minority coaches, by non-diverse coaching staff. And your resolution does not address why that situation has come about. The hiring director, when he, and it often is a he, that's our point. And when the head coach, he often is a he, we're saying this pledge will not only ensure that and be more effective in ensuring that these people are more diverse than just a white he, but also that even the white he's that remain, white men that remain, are trained in how to create an inclusive space for the rest of the institution. My time is up. Thank you very much.
Okay. Is everybody around who needs to be? I see representatives from both teams now. Okay. This was a great debate, everybody. I enjoyed watching it. I have some comments for all of the debaters, and I'll be offering how I decided the debate as well. So first, some of the comments for the individual speeches and debaters. Owen, I think your speeches, I liked the way that you offered the credentials of authors. I thought that was helpful in the first speech to separate who is the person that is part of the research that you're choosing to use to express points. I think it's great that you included examples from multiple sports rather than focusing narrowly on maybe one sport. I think that maybe there is a little too much time spent on the lack of diversity now that exists in some of these sports, though, because I don't think that's something the negative team will take issue with. So I think maybe more of the first speech should be about not just the underrepresentation now, but the benefits of why it would be good and what the new rule would offer to solve or address the underrepresentation in those sports that you mentioned. And I think that more eye contact, if possible, would be ideal in the first speech for laying the first impression for whoever the judge is in these public debate type of competitions. Archie, your first speech, I think you have some good body movement. I think the speed that you're going is very appropriate for a presentation like this and this style of competition. I like that many of the points appear to be grounded in some research. I thought the transitions used were helpful to guide the audience from point to point. I thought your eye contact in the first speech was useful, and the review at the conclusion of the speech, although helpful for maybe not technical audiences, maybe not as necessary for some of the judges you'll be getting at this tournament. Because ideally, if you notice they're writing down your 3 points in the body of the presentation, they may not need that review towards the end, and you could instead just add another point, a 4th point instead, or more attacks on one of the affirmative points instead. Christian, I think for your speeches, I thought the summary of your own points at the beginning of the speech was a useful way to start the speech. I think the new research that you're bringing up is responsive and useful. I liked the way you signposted in between points. There are some jargon terms I might advise you get rid of for your rest of your debates today, such as counterinterpretation or solvency. Those are words maybe, although familiar to some of the judges you will get at this competition, we want to try to debate in front of non-technical or non-expert, non-debate judges. So maybe eliminating those entirely or replacing them with some other words that maybe aren't insider terms. I think I would have wanted to see you address this legality argument in your first speech rather than have your team wait until the rebuttals to start addressing that argument. I'm not sure if you had some extra time in that first speech, but if you did, that's one place where I would have advised you to take some time and respond to that one, or cut out maybe a little of the summary in order to get to a response to that argument. I thought the cross-ex maybe when you were asking the questions did not go as well as maybe you'd hoped it would, and maybe some of that could be improved by maybe writing down questions in advance of the debate could help a little bit more with the asking part of the question periods for your team. Andrew, I thought that as a result of the lack of focus on the legality argument in the affirmative speech, I thought it was good that you chose to bring it up again and talk about it more. I think that the speed at which you're going is appropriate for this competition, and the just extemporaneous style where you're trying to make it sound conversational is appropriate. The variety and enthusiasm and emphasis to make certain terms stand out is also appropriate. And I think those are the comments I had for individual speeches. So to talk about some of the arguments that happened in the last few rebuttals and how I made a decision. So some issues that stood out to me. First, there is some contention between the term minorities or the term transgender versus transgenders. And I definitely think in the future, the affirmative team wants to think about whether they want to say transgender people or transgenders and what you're willing to defend, and the term minority participation being part of the resolution. So choosing to use that term may be a result of not personal beliefs, but what is written into the topic that you've been scheduled to debate today. So I would think about those things more. And then as it relates to how those terms get executed into an argument in the debate, I certainly see why the negative team has flagged that this could be a problem, but I'm also unsure of what the remedy for a judge is to do in these short 4 to 6 minute speeches. So I've heard that the negative takes issue with the terms the affirmative is using. Now the next step is, how much of your speech are you willing to talk about that in, and what ought I to do? Is my remedy that I should punish the other team with a loss? Is my remedy that I should lower the points of the speaker who used the terms? Is my remedy that maybe I can't take their advocacy as seriously or as genuine, maybe? Or why will the use of those terms doom their policy that they're proposing as an addition to a new rule? So I think there's certainly ways to go to make that an offensive argument or a reason that you should now win the debate or give you an edge to win the debate. But I'm not sure as of the 2 final speeches on those terms as to what I'm meant to do with that as an argument. Another issue that came up is interviewing 2 candidates better than interviewing 1 candidate, or not having a rule at all about how many minority candidates to be interviewing? And I definitely think that throughout the debate, the affirmative has some evidence that they're bringing up from 2016, this Colorado study by Professor Johnson, that there is a significant difference between making any individual member school interview at least 2 candidates compared to 1 or compared to none. And I don't think their rebuttal is the first time they're bringing up that 30 or 33% figure. I think that's been a rather prominent feature of all of the affirmative speeches. So one thing I would have wanted to see from both sides is comparison of this Colorado study versus this Forbes study that the negative team is bringing up. So what are the differences between maybe the research methods? Maybe does the recency of the study matter? Does it matter what sports that were covered by the studies? Maybe does the sample size matter? Was it longitudinal studies? So things that would compare, okay, so we both now have studies that are on this subject. Why should the judge prefer one over the other one? And maybe that could also help the negative engage with, okay, well, what does the counter plan of the diversity pledge do differently, so that if the negative's claim is that two is not better than one because it doesn't change that the interviewer themselves remains biased, then talk to me through what is it about the pledge that is different that would resolve that question. So does the interviewer sign the pledge? Is that a reason why the bias or root of the issue would now be handled, or something about the schools signing the pledge is able to fix that problem in some way, make it go away? I definitely think the legality issue was also present in the last two rebuttals. And I think that I'm sort of confused as to, again, what the pledge would do to resolve that issue, but also hiring or interviewing 1 to 2 people of a certain demographic does not really preclude that the affirmative could also still advocate interviewing other candidates of not that demographic. And if it is true that, and I think you should have said this in the debate, the affirmative team, but it seems like if that person that you're saying is an independent auditor is from the University of Central Florida and their objection is about Florida law, then perhaps that person would be, in a way, able to address that loophole question, or as it results to the state of Florida. But that wasn't really an issue that came up. So the issues that I was primarily deciding at the end of the debate, and I thought it was very close, and some of these talking points that I've already mentioned could have influenced my decision either way. At the end, I decided to vote for the affirmative team from Boston College. I thought that the reason to do a new rule to interview at least 2 candidates would be a good idea compared to current plans of what we do now in the status quo. I think that Colorado study was sufficient for me to address the would this result in tokenization? And there is some chance it might be illegal in one state. That's true. I don't think that the affirmative had a great response to here's why Florida FSU why it would still work there and not be perhaps illegal. But I had some more question marks about the pledge than I did with the affirmative plan, because throughout the debate, the affirmative has charged that a pledge would just be a lot less binding and credible than imposed sanctions that the ACC could do with their route. And the affirmative has said they're not sure if the pledge advocated by the negative would affect ADs, athletic directors. So the affirmative's proposal would encompass both head coaches and athletic directors. And I'm not sure if the pledge would cover both groups. And overall, I'm sort of unclear what it is that the pledge would do to create an inclusive space. So what is the mandate or directive or inducement that now members and interviewers have to foster inclusivity in some way that works out those problems? So those are the reasons why I decided to vote the way I did. I'm not sure when the next debate starts, but I'm sure I have some time if you all have any questions for me that you want to ask. And I'm sure that you all are going to do great in your next set of debates.
We'd love to ask specific questions, but unfortunately, Archie and I will need to have lunch because we didn't eat very much breakfast. So maybe we could ask